Robben Island utanför Kapstaden i Sydafrika. Det var här Nelson Mandela satt den mesta tiden av sina 27 år i fängelse. Hans brott, att bekämpa apartheid. Nu är vi på väg till Robben Island där Nelson Mandela alltså satt närmare 20 år av sitt liv. Man ser den så här på avstånd så kan man tycka att det ser rätt så idylliskt ut, men det var det definitivt inte. Garanterat rymningssäkert är det i alla fall. Ingen har någonsin lyckats ta sig levande härifrån. Hello, Nelson Mandela.
Well, good morning. Very happy to be interviewed by you.
Thank you. Your real name is Nelson Rolihlahla. Rolihlahla,
Yes.
which means the troublemaker. I wonder how did your parents know?
No, that often happens in life for a child to be given a name, and by coincidence, you act in accordance with that name. But it is not anything, you see, that is divined, predetermined by nature. It's just an accident.
An accident.
And my parents gave me that name in the context of what happens in the countryside, and where a person who is pulling a branch, because the name means the one who pulls a branch, creates storms, dust, and so on, which you normally do before a conflict, those days, before a fight. And it's a coincidence that I've got into trouble.
Okay. Were you a troublemaker even as a child?
Well, I don't think so. My parents, they say, would answer to that. But I grew up as somebody very shy and afraid of women.
Yes.
And but I like playing sticks with other boys, because this was our way, you know, of becoming a champion and winning some respect in your community, to be an expert in stick fighting, and to be known for bravery when you're fighting with boys from other villages. That I tried to make my contribution from that side. But when it came to things like relations with women and debating at school, I was very shy. It was only later, when I went to high school and then to university, that I discarded my fear and found myself so interested in students' politics that without me knowing, I was fully involved, both in discussions and in planning action.
And you studied a lot, you became a lawyer, but you hardly practiced because you devoted your life to the fight for freedom and democracy. Was this a very deliberate choice you made?
I was being groomed for the position of chieftaincy. And were it not for a forced marriage, from which I ran away, I would probably today be a dignified chief, you know, with a big stomach and very comfortable. But I had to run away. But I'd already decided, you know, to take up a legal career. And I struggled, you know, to qualify as a lawyer.
But you hardly practiced, because then you devoted your life to the fight for freedom and democracy.
It is true that I could have spent more time on the profession itself, but I never had that opportunity.
No. But I mean, you were a young man that loved life, you had a young wife, children, you loved boxing, girls, well, everything. And to me, it seems as if you devoted your life so strongly to this fight for freedom. Did you have time for all the rest?
Well, One of the things that I regretted very much, which is, of course, a problem for all politicians, is the inability to have a dignified and secure home life. Because to go back home at the end of the day, to share the association with your wife, and to play with your children, to sit at table during the evening meal, is the desire of every man. I regretted that very much. There was a time, for example, when my son was about 5 years old, and we were in a campaign, and I had to leave early before he got up, come back home after he was asleep. He had to ask the mother, "Mom, where does my father stay now?" And those things are very painful. And when I was underground, my daughter, eldest daughter, Zeni, she was only about 18 months. She came to a place where I had arranged to see them whilst I was underground. And she looked at my attire and felt that there must be some part of my clothing around this house. And she looked around because I had taken away my disguise and hidden it.
Yeah.
She looked around, saw it, pulled it out, gave it to me, grabbed my hand and said, "Dad, let's go home." So as I tried to persuade her that, "Look, I will come back one day," she just cried. And it was embarrassing because we're in a European, in a flat, in a building of flats occupied by Europeans only. And the crying could attract attention. But those are some of the bitter moments I sometimes recall when my child, wants the care and the love and the security of his father. She cannot have it.
Would you say this was the highest price that you paid for your fight?
No, I am no different from others. At least I was comparatively well known. And friends who were well-to-do came to our assistance, to the assistance of the family. And there is nothing which gives you courage and strength in prison when you know that your friends are there, that in spite of the problems which your family has, but you have powerful friends who are loyal to you and who are giving assistance to your family. That gave me a lot of courage.
You lived underground and you were harassed in many ways, banned, and you were also in prison for a couple of years. But then you were convicted in 1964 for conspiracy against the state. And when you pleaded, you said that I am willing to die for this cause. This is a very tough thing to say.
Yes, I had to say that, not from a spirit of bravado, but because I genuinely felt that they were going to hang us. And it is the desire of every freedom fighter to disappear under a cloud of glory rather than that of shame. It is the task of a freedom fighter, when you see that the end of your days has come, to live a tradition of bravery, determination to face even death for your principles. And I thought about it. It was not because I was brave, but because one had a duty to perform at that moment.
You were sentenced to life imprisonment and you were moved to the feared Robben Island, where I'm going today, by the way.
That's very good.
Yes.
Very good.
You were moved to Robben Island. It's a very, very tough place. How could you keep up your spirit?
Well, the position is that I was not alone. I was with about 30 others in my section. Men of a real ability and with a high level of education. They studied some overseas.
And you did too?
Yes, qualified in universities overseas. And to sit down and talk to them was a real privilege, because every time you sat down with them, they widened your horizons. And then we had time to read all kinds of literature, which also enriched your own attitude and spirit. And equally important was the ability to sit down and to think, something which I don't have outside jail. To sit down and think and to do nothing else is an important part of your struggle. And by sitting down and standing away from yourself and looking at your past work, the mistakes that you have made, is one of the most important moments in the life of anybody, in particular of a politician.
Ja, det här är alltså den cell som Nelson Mandela satt i över 18 år av sitt liv. Vad kan den vara? Kanske 1,5 gånger 2 meter på sin höjd. Toahink i hörnet. Det fanns garanterat inga blommor på den tiden. Det var överhuvudtaget ett fruktansvärt hårt och torftigt liv han levde här. Till mat så fick de mest kall majsgröt och hela dagarna så var de ute och slet i ett kalkbrott. Did you never get depressed while you were in prison?
Oh, naturally. I was depressed several times. But the dominating feeling was one of a conviction that whatever difficulties I have, I will return. And our struggle will triumph in the end. That was the dominating theme. But within that context, there were moments when one doubted whether, in fact, we will succeed. There were moments when the enemy appeared too strong, when the organization was in disarray, in tatters. And in those moments, you had to think realistically and to say, can I, from myself, help my colleagues outside who are doing such monumental work and sacrificing themselves? And in those moments, the feeling of helplessness was there, especially when I saw my colleagues like Oliver Tambo, a man who had a BSc degree, a musician, a very accomplished musician, wonderful speaker, struggling in order to ensure that freedom comes to this country and that his colleagues in jails are liberated. And when I saw my wife and children being humiliated without the security of her husband, security of their father, those were the darkest moments in my life in prison.
What gave you hope during these moments?
Pardon?
What could give you hope during
I
these
say,
black
as I
moments?
say, my friends,
Your
were
friends
there.
in the prison.
The literature I read showed how freedom fighters were in a similar situation and even worse, and how they triumphed in the end.
But it's
And
hard.
then the ability to sit down and think and to see our people outside, and nevertheless, in spite of all the problems, keeping the fires of liberation burning.
But still, I mean, when I try to identify with you, it's very, very hard to do that. I mean, you had children. You didn't see your 2 baby daughters until they were 16 years old.
Yes.
Your eldest son died in a car accident. Your mother died. Your wife, Winnie, was, as you said, humiliated. She was put in prison. I mean, what made you not become bitter?
No, as I say, I had this company of very gifted, very talented comrades around me. And you must also remember that right from the beginning of our sentences, there was a very serious debate amongst warders themselves. Some saying, let's treat these men severely so that they should never again challenge white supremacy. There were others who said, no, we are making a mistake. These people in history frequently win, and this might win. And when they do, they will treat us harshly, as we do. Let us treat them decently and give them all the privileges so that when they come into power, they should not be bitter against us. Indeed, they won in the sense that they were able to make our conditions in prison relatively comfortable. But of course, it was our organization outside the country, outside the jail, in the country and abroad, that really brought about these changes. But the warders themselves made some sort of humble contribution.
Okay.
And that is why I invited some of them to my inauguration and to the first session of Parliament.
During the last years of your imprisonment, you stayed in a pretty decent bungalow, and there were secret negotiations with the government going on about the release of you and others and the future of the ANC. And they also tried to help you to adjust to the outside world by taking you out in a car and letting you walk around. And once you were actually left alone in the car with the possibility to walk out
Yes, quite. Yeah.
and have your freedom.
Yes, yes. No, those, of course, were exciting moments. And that is why one never forgot that even behind bars and in the most conservative of all communities, you still have men and women who are humane and who would like to make every human being as happy as possible in that situation. The warders and the officials, to me, were, generally speaking, very generous. Perhaps this may not be said of everybody, but speaking for myself, they were quite generous, and they made me as happy as possible in prison.
But then you were finally free. The 11th of February 1990, they let you out after 27 years. What was the most intense feeling that you had this day?
Well, I always find it difficult to look back and to identify such moments. But I was called by de Klerk on the 9th of that month, 2 days before my release. And he told me that I was going to be released on the Sunday. Well, that was exciting. But at the same time, I wanted that our people must be given a proper notice that I'm coming out. And so we debated this, and it looked ironic that the jailer must say, go away. And I said, look, give me at least 2 weeks.
So you postponed the freedom, actually?
Well, more or less. And but that was a moment of conflict in me, because I wanted to go out as soon as possible. At the same time, I wanted to give my colleagues the opportunity to prepare for my release. And of course, one of the things I wanted to do was to be able to say thank you to the warders who look after me. And I had arranged for them, to stand outside next to the gate so that I can shake their hands and those of their families. I had no idea of the size of the crowd that was waiting for me outside. And when I saw that crowd, it aroused feelings of excitement I couldn't control, I couldn't describe, welled up inside me. And it was, I thought of my colleagues who had struggled to bring about this day, some of whom paid the highest price, paid with their lives. All these things, milled around, my mind. And I was in this state of turmoil as I came out. But nevertheless, the dominating thing was that I am free at last.
The situation now in South Africa is very tough in many ways. I've been around a little and I've seen, I mean, the unemployment is up to almost 60% among the blacks. Crime rate is up higher than ever. People live in shacks, the poor people. When do you see a turning point?
Problem?
When do you see a turning point?
Oh, I see. Well, I think it's too early to expect a government which has been in power for 6 months to have solved such ugly questions. You have seen, for example, what happened to the Depression in 1933. How long did it take the leaders of those days, who had all the qualifications, who had all the resources, who had all the infrastructure? They couldn't prevent that depression, and when it occurred, it took years before they could solve the problems connected with that situation. Why should we be expected to be able to solve these matters in 6 months? It's difficult to put deadlines for problems of socio-economic problems of this nature. All that we can tell you is that the plans that we have worked out are on course. And we believe, therefore, that in due course, we will be able to address these problems.
Apartheid is no more, but there are still racist attitudes. I interviewed recently the most powerful industrial leader in Sweden, Peter Wallenberg, and he said that apartheid had its faults, but it had parts necessary given circumstances at the time. What's your comment on this?
Well, there was never a time for brutality and cruelty where certain communities even used the name of the Lord in order to justify the commission of abominable crimes against humanity. There was never a time for that. And I do not agree with the famous industrialist. Apartheid was wrong right from the beginning. And it is not the only case where there has been oppression, but some oppressive systems were more humane than the system that was applied by the South African oppressors.
He also said that the black people cannot help themselves without the help of the white minority in South Africa.
Well, we have brought about freedom without the help of the whites. And we have been able to overthrow apartheid by our own steam. And people who talk like that just do not know what is happening in the country. They are superficial in their approach.
Johann Heinz was assassinated only 3 days ago. Are you yourself afraid of assassination?
Scores of freedom fighters have been assassinated during the last 2 to 3 decades. We are a collective or a team. It doesn't matter who goes. There are capable men and women who are leading this organization. And the sunlight in which we are now bathing was created not by those who were relaxing in prison for 27 years, but by our comrades who were struggling under very difficult conditions to ensure that the fires of freedom keep burning in the country. And as far as assassinations are concerned, these assassinations have been going. And if anybody becomes alarmed about them, you'll be paralyzed, you'll never do anything.
When you see Africa today, there are a lot of very, very big problems. Famine, AIDS. The whole of Africa has only 2% of the world trade, and there are environmental disasters. Can you be optimistic?
Well, what else would one expect? Because in spite of the mistakes made by African leaders in their policies, nevertheless, this is the heritage of the era of colonialism, where the colonial powers never cared about raising the living standards of the people of the colonies. They were concerned, with exploiting the raw materials, building roads to the harbors, which they built in order to ensure that these raw materials reach the motherland. They come back as processed goods and exploit, sell them to the people at exorbitant prices. Never established proper schools, proper hospitals, and created industries in order, to absorb the population. What else did one expect? A leadership which had really no high standard of literacy. And these things had to happen. Whereas we don't condone the mistakes made by some African leaders, but at the same time, Africans have produced very competent leaders who are addressing problems in their country after the teething troubles of emancipation, of liberation. They are now thinking hard on how to organize their countries and to make sure that the living standards of our people, the living conditions are improved.
You have written a self-biography that is about to be published now, and in the very end you say something very interesting, I think. You say, I struggled not only for freedom for the suppressed, but also for freedom for those who suppressed. Can you explain that a little?
Well, naturally, that is important in our country, because the tiny minority of whites that was in power in this country and that oppressed us were not free. They were seized by fear, and they were insecure. They did not know what changes would mean as far as their living conditions are concerned. Would they be able to maintain these privileges which have enriched their lives? It was natural. And any freedom fighter who was now looking beyond the mere liberation had to consider the interests of the minorities as well. The basic concern, of course, was the living conditions of the black majority that had struggled. We have brought about liberation in order to address their basic needs first and foremost. But at the same time, we have been denied the educational opportunities. We have no people with real knowledge and skills and expertise. The white minority, because of the historical situation, have those skills. We had to ensure that they remain in the country and to help us to build the new South Africa. That is what I meant in that sentence.
When you came out finally, you divorced your wife, which was very sad, you said. And you said when you announced this, she married a man who left her. The man became a myth. This myth returned home, and it turned out to be just a man. Can you explain this a little more?
No, I'm not divorced from my wife. We separated by agreement. I wouldn't like to go into details as to why we separated, except to say that she is a wonderful person, gifted, very brave, very assertive, and she will make a contribution towards building a new South Africa. But I've got my own idea of how a couple should live together, how they should handle their own domestic problems, and the image they should have in society. And in spite of my respect for her, it was necessary for us to part.
Could you say, what is love to you?
Well, life has to be enjoyed.
Sorry, I said, what is love to you?
Life to me?
Love.
Oh, I see love, I'm sorry. Well, there are certain things I cannot explain. But I believe in the saying that in the rough marble, beauty hides unseen. In the still air, music lies unheard. I like to share the association of the people who have virtues I admire. I like to sit down with the opposite sex and to share priceless moments with them, if I can.
Do you believe in God?
Well, that is a matter which is intimate and which is the concern of the individual himself and not to be paraded. But I can tell you that I was baptized in the church. I used to attend church until I was drawn into politics, and I had to have commitments on a Sunday. And in prison, there were various denominations that came to minister to us. I made it a point to attend every church service outside my own denomination. I kept a steady correspondence with people like Archbishop Tutu and others. And one of the things I did when I was appointed president was to go to all the religious groups, to the Muslims, to the mosque, to the Jewish synagogue, and to the churches of the Dutch Reformed Church, to the Christian churches, in order to show our appreciation to the role religion had played in our lives and in our liberation.
Do you still keep the glove that Mike Tyson sent you?
Oh yes, no, I have.
After he won the championship?
Yes, I have that glove.
Do you like professional boxing?
Well, there are differences of opinion as far as professional boxing is concerned because of the injuries it causes. But statistics shows that professional boxing is not the sport that is leading in injuries. You have rugby. It causes a lot of injuries, and yet in this country it is a religion. And you have other contact sports which have contributed to an enormous volume of injuries. There is no hue and cry against them. And I think society should be even-handed.
How is your health?
Well, my health for my age is reasonably good.
Do you have a little problem with your eye?
Well, I suffered from dry tears in Robben Island. So they have done something to my tear ducts in order to give me tears.
Yeah.
But the flow of tears now is a little bit more than I want.
But when you were in prison, you mean you could never cry?
Well, you don't know. There were secret moments in which I did all sorts of things I wouldn't like to admit in public.
Is it true that when you came to Stockholm to get the Nobel Prize, that you secretly sneaked out of the hotel early in the morning without the security guards knowing?
Well, I do that now and again because I like moments, when I can move alone. I like that.
So you did that in Stockholm too?
Well, I did that in Stockholm. I do that in South Africa as well.
Okay.
At the time.
Who do you admire?
Well, that has always been a difficult question. Diplomatically, it's completely unwise to say I admire so-and-so, and you offend others. But I admire men and women who have made the world the theater of their operations, who try to fight human rights wherever they are violated, and who wanted to put a little bit of sunshine in the hearts of others, who wanted to make other people feel that it is worth to live. Those are my heroes.
It's very funny, when I interview you, it's mostly very easy to find critical questions to put to somebody like you. But you seem so thoroughly good in a way, like Mother Teresa to me. Could you help me? What are your biggest faults?
Faults?
Your faults. Do you have any?
Well, I have a lot of faults. If you ask my friend over there in the National Executive, they hammer me from beginning to end.
Yes.
Because of the mistakes I've made. And so I am no messiah, and that is why I have opposed any idea to try and raise my level to that of a messiah. I have never been. I'm an ordinary human being, and I don't want everybody to give me a status which I do not deserve. Assure me that your husband will not be jealous.
Don't worry. I think he's going to be very proud.
Very good.
Okay, so if you just look in that camera and make a little jump up in the air.
A jump? No,
jump.
no.
But I help you.
No.
Okay.
What is the purpose of that?
Because hope in Swedish means hope.
I see.
To jump is the same as hope.
No.
So everybody.
Let's exclude that.
Sure? You can't just do
I
like
can
this.
embrace you. That I'm prepared to do.
Robben Island utanför Kapstaden i Sydafrika. Det var här Nelson Mandela satt den mesta tiden av sina 27 år i fängelse. Hans brott, att bekämpa apartheid. Nu är vi på väg till Robben Island där Nelson Mandela alltså satt närmare 20 år av sitt liv. Man ser den så här på avstånd så kan man tycka att det ser rätt så idylliskt ut, men det var det definitivt inte. Garanterat rymningssäkert är det i alla fall. Ingen har någonsin lyckats ta sig levande härifrån. Hello, Nelson Mandela.
Well, good morning. Very happy to be interviewed by you.
Thank you. Your real name is Nelson Rolihlahla. Rolihlahla,
Yes.
which means...
And I struggled, to qualify as a lawyer.
But you hardly practice because then you devoted your life to the fight for freedom and democracy.
It is true that I could have spent more time on the profession itself, but I never had that opportunity.
No. But I mean, you were a young man that loved life, you had a young wife, children, you loved boxing, girls, well, everything. And to me, it seems as if you devoted your life so strongly to this fight for freedom. Did you have time for all the rest?
Well, one of the things that I regretted very much, which is, of course, a problem for all politicians, is the inability to have a dignified and secure home life. Because to go back home at the end of the day, to share the association with that, I've got into trouble.
Okay. Were you a troublemaker even as a child?
Well, I don't think so. My parents, they say, would answer to that. But I grew up as somebody very shy and afraid of women.
Yes?
And but I like playing sticks with other boys because this was our way, of becoming a champion and winning some respect in your community, to be an expert in stick fighting, and to be known for bravery when you're fighting with boys from other villages. I tried to make my contribution from that side. But when it came to things like relations with women and debating at school, I was very shy. It was only later when I went to high school and then to university that I discarded my fear and found myself so interested in students' politics that without me knowing, I was fully involved, both in discussions and in planning action.
And you studied a lot, you became a lawyer, but you hardly practiced because you devoted your life to the fight for freedom and democracy. Was this a very deliberate choice you made?
I was being groomed for the position of chieftaincy. And were it not for a forced marriage from which I ran away, I would probably today be a dignified chief, with a big stomach and very comfortable. But I had to run away. But I'd already decided, to take up a legal career.
Means the troublemaker. I wonder
What?
how did your parents know?
No, that often happens in life for a child to be given a name, and by coincidence, you act in accordance with that name. But it is not anything, you see, that is divined, predetermined by nature. It's just an accident.
An accident.
And my parents gave me that name in the context of what happens in the countryside, and where a person who is pulling a branch, because the name means the one who pulls a branch creates storms, dust, and so on, which you normally do before a conflict, those days, before a fight. And it's a coincidence